All right, this one's been a long time coming. It's been a while since we've seen each other face to face. Today, on another episode of Duck It, we have Ovais, good friend, was a mentor as well along
That's
my
kind
career.
of you to say.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I think this conversation can go in many directions. One, because we have a friendship. Two, because you're so well versed in so many things. And so your experience is going to be really interesting to talk about today. I'd like by just telling people how we met and how this all began. In one of the roles that I had at Kareem, as I took over marketing, the CEO at the time, Mudassir, was keen for us to meet. He said, this guy knows his stuff. He knows marketing, he knows brand, he understands it, speak to Ovais. And I think that's the first time we met.
I think so, yeah.
And our relationship evolved tremendously. So did my career and I think all the things that we're doing separately. But I would just love for you to kind of, tell us a little bit about, back in the day, you were, a member of Abraaj and you were in the VC space, in a space that's very different to what it looks like today.
Yeah.
And your role in that, in that fund and your ride, especially with Kareem, et cetera. If there's anything that you think you could share with us about that time, I think that'd be super interesting.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Chris. Pleasure as ever. So I think that, going back in time to 2009-10,
yeah,
the big driver was job creation, which you don't hear about much now, which is interesting. The data was 60 to 70 million people, youth unemployed in the region. How do we create jobs? And it was never going to happen in traditional industry in terms of the rapid growth of job creation in auto or in any other area, which you traditionally find in Western economies. Big factory type job creation.
Yeah.
So all the data, Kaufman and so forth, suggested job creation happens through stimulating entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship happens across all age groups, even older people. And that governments and the private sector need to work together to create those jobs.
Yeah.
And obviously capital and venture capital and private equity play a role in that. So that was pretty central to the thinking, which was, in this evolving ecosystem of what was beginning to look like venture capital, but was a bit disorganized. How can key players emerge? How do you build an ecosystem, connect academia, public sector, private sector, entrepreneurship, mentoring, programming, connectivity, networks, capital, angel, investing.
Was that central to the mission of Abraaj in its approach?
Was basically create a brand. To do that, initially it was a fund called Riada Enterprise Development, RED, which then became, there was a subset of that focused on content and collaboration called WAMDA, which was created. Abraaj, Syntax in Jordan were closely involved, and a number of key stakeholders, Fadi Gondur being one of the certainly primary ones, who'd been a founder at Aramex, significant early stage investor, Maktub and so forth, going back to the mid-2000s. So you had a few success stories already around 2004, 5, 6, 7, if you call success raising capital and getting on the map. But eventually the sale of Maktub to Abraaj, and then to Tiger Global, and then to Yahoo, was the big success story around 2005, 6, 7, 8.
Yeah.
And then, Souk kind of, I think, got built around that period. And Jabbar Internet Group, I would imagine, started around that period as well. So that's kind of where it all came together. And then we started Wamda.com as a content collaboration platform, the idea being to have founders being able to talk to each other, access expertise, access content. If I'm sitting in Syria or Iraq or Pakistan or, Kuwait even, or Saudi Arabia, how do you get to a common frequency around knowledge, expertise, and collaboration opportunity? So that's kind of where it all started.
And so the infrastructure itself that we know today, in terms of how people communicate, how they connect, how the resources are accessed for entrepreneurs or funds themselves, a lot of those building blocks were kind of initiated from that era.
I would say so, because when you take that WAMDA concept and you take the celebration of entrepreneurship, which also happened at the end of 2010, that was in many ways the kickoff around pulling in global stakeholders, pulling in the United States, European type stakeholders, and making them aware that the Middle East was an opportunity both to invest and to pull in partnership opportunities. So that's kind of, for me, that's where it started. But obviously, everybody has their own vantage point.
Of course. And now you fast forward like 10, 15 years, and you see the state of the market today. Is it what you imagined?
I don't think it's ever what you imagine, because scaling and growth happens in a completely unpredictable way.
Yeah.
You can't plot it. Theoretically, you'd go, WAMDA 2010, Celebration of Entrepreneurship 2010, funds start emerging, angel networks emerge. There's a linear progression. It's never linear. It's like a hockey stick. Absolutely. When nothing appears to happen for 5 years or 6 years even, apart from a few successes, and then bang, it goes mad. That's generally what happens in life, I think.
And what do you think was the catalyst? Like, what was the beginning of the hockey stick curve in your mind?
I would say that 2 or 3 factors. One was probably the success of Kareem, I think, is a factor. Not just the exit, because that's relatively recent, but the emergence of a cross-geographic business, because the big challenge was always, how do you scale into Saudi? How do you get into Pakistan or Turkey or Egypt? And that was a unique success story of a business that actually managed to do it.
Absolutely.
As in actually do Saudi Arabia and actually do Egypt primarily, and then do Pakistan as well. Successfully execute, find a go-to-market model, find a value proposition, find a customer segment, find growth resources. You can hit the ground practically with a backpack and execute in that market. I mean, to be able to go from here, certainly to execute in Pakistan, it's not a joke. To do Karachi is hard enough. To do Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad is hard enough. To start doing tier 1, tier 2 cities and Peshawar and other towns people have never heard of, that's not easy. So I think doing that and doing it in Egypt and effectively penetrating Saudi Arabia with a very local value proposition, I think that was a big piece of it. And then there are other players along the way, Souk, for example. I think Kareem is probably the defining example of geographic expansion done at its best.
It almost sounds like the creation of a consolidated large market is the catalyst, right? Because if startups ring fence their business within just Dubai or within just Riyadh or just Cairo, the growth potential is always somewhat, plateauing kind of early and not interesting enough for kind of that catalyst or that spark to kind of ignite it, a proper ecosystem. And that bringing of 600-700 million people, I think is what, the major kind of, and the ability to do it successfully sounds like that's what the major change was.
I think that's generally true. I mean, I think the impediment to putting capital in is that, they'll get you a good place in the UAE, but they're not going to get further. The moment you can effectively begin execution in Saudi and in other markets, it becomes an investable value proposition because people see the scale. So if I was an outsider sitting in London or Silicon Valley, I'd go, it's a reasonable market, but I don't see the growth. I don't see a consistent way of reaching new geographies and so on. But a business like Kareem managed to do that. And don't forget, what you get is you get that growth, and then you get capital coming in along the way, which is successively more, dare I say it, more sophisticated and more international. You go from quality local investors to Saudi investors to, Rakuten, Kingdom, global investor, Abraaj at that time, emerging markets investor.
I think that's super true. Even internally, I remember when Rakuten had confirmed their investment and we were getting Rakuten's investment, that even changed our confidence levels as a business at the time. It really made things different for us.
Suddenly you've got the blue chip guys who know their stuff, and they're looking at you and they see your operating metrics, they see your performance, they see your leadership capability, they see your growth, and they see your ability to get to an exit. And they're not doing it philanthropically, they're doing it because they can see this becoming the next Didi or the next Ola or the next Grab. The moment you've got an investor like that, you're on your way.
So now fast forward 2021, there are hundreds of VCs. There are deals happening every day almost. There's, a ton of excitement about the kind of scale of the ecosystem at the moment. But I'm always, weary of the circumstances, and I'm always a bit worried. And I wonder if the maturity of the market deserves that type of access to capital at the moment. What's your kind of perspective? So on one side, it's amazing. The size of the market, the opportunity, the innovation, the talent, all of it has improved. But it kind of feels that a lot of it is hype. It feels like a lot of it is not really warranted. And it feels like a lot of the bad stories and the failures are not being told. What's your kind of view of the market, these days?
Yeah, I think there's a natural evolution in venture capital, which is that there are cycles, and those cycles build on each other. And you've got to go through 2 or 3 cycles to get to your optimal kind of stability as an ecosystem. We're still, for all the 2010-11 talk just now, we're still broadly in the first wave.
Yeah.
This is a first wave, call it 2017-18 to 2020-21. You're starting to see the emergence of some really good stories. I certainly don't want to talk about just the things I've invested in or we've invested in, but Kitobi is an example of a business which has pivoted successfully to deep penetration in the GCC from a European and wider expansion, which in due course the company will get to, but right now the primary focus is deeper GCC, penetrating Saudi and so on, which has been done to dramatically successful effect in 2020, and the business has hit all of its expectations around growth, scale, budget already. And that shows you how deep the market is in the right industry post-COVID, which is, for those who don't know, cloud kitchen and effectively brands franchising their recipe to a third party like Kitobi, who then partners with a delivery company to deliver the menu or a subset of the menu to consumers.
I think Mohammed Balut is our next guest.
Oh, that's good.
Or the one after that. Yeah. So,
So he's great.
So he's going to be interesting. Yeah.
A great operator and a great fundraiser.
Absolutely.
And,
very humble.
And humble, and, he's execution oriented tremendously and has built a great team. So I guess you've got those success stories, and then you've got, generally speaking, what would I say? I'd say you're going to have a bunch of things not working. You're going to have a lot of venture capital available, which is not necessarily even the quality of capital that the founder should be looking at, because when you look at capital, you've got to be looking at operational value add, in my opinion, but certainly as a base level, strategic value. The moment it's just money, I think you're not going to get much from it. In fact, it may well even impede you. It's not really going to help you too much. So I think what you're getting is an ecosystem evolving of, dare I say, informed money, operationally oriented money, strategic money, synergistic money around capital from groups who have core traditional activities that may be useful for a venture capital funded business to penetrate. So in other words, if I'm a Kitopi and my investor is a very deep Saudi food and beverage investor or a strong operator with strong connectivity and a strong position in Saudi, that's valuable. So, you can get that kind of value, or you can get much more limited value. So that's the first thing I'd say. There is a lot of capital. Different people will argue differently and go, there isn't enough capital. I don't know. I see a lot of capital from where I'm standing, and not all of it is entirely well informed in terms of the best practices around due diligence and really understanding the value drivers in a business benchmark to what's happening internationally. In my opinion, you've got to do a deal in the region and know what companies like that look like in Indonesia or India or Mexico or Nigeria or Turkey. If you don't have that lens, in my opinion, it's two-dimensional money. And no disrespect to any of the regional VCs, but that's a different model to being genuinely global and understanding how it looks. So I think, it's going to shake out, and like everything, it's going to filter to good players, good companies, and there'll be a shakeout set in the next 12, 18 months.
Yeah, I think when I look at it from a positive lens, the good byproduct of what's happening is a lot of talent is being developed. They're learning what to do or what not to do, but a lot of talent is being attracted to the region. The more startups we have, the more money there is in the market, the more talent will flock to here, or the more talent will be developed through experience. So fundamentally, whether they succeed or they fail doesn't really matter, so long as they've tried something and that experience has been developed. And whatever happens in the next 3 to 5 years, at least the talent will have, kind of evolved and learned something. So generally, from a positive lens, I keep telling myself, well, at least we're going to have more talent, more experienced talent. At least we're going to attract, talent from different regions as well.
I think so. I mean, if I were to pick up on that point, Chris, I think the single biggest trigger that I've seen in the last 12 months, like literally, if you said to me, what's changed in the last 12 months, I'd say obviously COVID has meant that there's an acceleration of certain subsectors in tech, which have just basically rocketed, whether it's food delivery, whether it's e-commerce in general, whether it's telehealth and digital medicine, whether it's multiple forms of marketplaces, etc. There's obviously a growth that's come as a result of that. The other thing that's happened is that I think the biggest trigger to what you just described is alumni networks developing from the success stories. People, dare I say it, leaving Kareem, leaving Souk, stroke Amazon, leaving Noon, leaving Kitopi even. I mean, that all means that people have learned over a 2 to 5 year period where the gaps are that they see in the landscape and what they can do to accelerate that. That's the second factor. Third factor is people with global experience coming back. They worked in international funds, worked in other companies globally, and want to come back here and do stuff. And the fourth factor, I think, is actually when you've done something, failure is the wrong word, but if you've learned from past experience and you're on your second, third, fourth cycle of doing stuff, you're eventually going to hit exactly the business that's both right for you, that feels like what you want to do, certainly for a long time, and you build a team around it and so on. So that's also starting to happen. I mean, Kitopi's great, but it's not the first thing Mo has done. And you're starting to see people like that, where you see the same names emerging, and that's a great thing because they're doing a second and a third thing. And then also you've got the multinationals throwing off people. I mean, a lot of people who are, ex-Unilever, ex-P&G, ex-Pepsi, ex-L'Oreal, a lot of those people are going, what can I do in the tech space? Because traditional FMCG, traditional distribution, etc., is not where the opportunities are. And you're even getting, for example, 20 years ago, the dynamic success story was Aramex. Now Aramex is the incumbent with all the associated challenges of being an incumbent. Maturity, corporatized, perhaps risk of over-corporatization, entrepreneurial talent doesn't necessarily flock that way. 10, 15 years ago, I saw people join those kinds of organizations. Now it's like, actually, I want to join more nimble career marketplaces and other logistics players, whether it's digitization of freight or whether it's logistics or whether it's last mile. So, you're starting to get multiple career options. So I think when you add all that up, plus a confidence level as well as the big human psychological factor, you've got to be confident in yourself. And behaviorally, I've seen a big shift. I think there's a different level of maturity now. When you talk to a founder, grasp of numbers, grasp of criticality of team, grasp of market conditions and competition, and having a deep understanding of the value drivers in that business, that's also evolved. So you add all that up and it's different.
And so how has the kind of investment ethos kind of changed now? So today in the region, what do you invest in? Are there specific industries? Are there specific kind of territories? I mean, apart from the kind of caliber of the entrepreneurs themselves, what's the ethos? Because if you look at e-commerce or last mile, I don't know many successful exits in that space, right? So they kind of feel like industries that you'll never have a successful exit anymore, especially with players like Amazon and Noon that just, it's never going to happen. And you look at, organizations like Spree, like AWOC, almost making it, but not, what's the ethos now for kind of industry and territory, or the general investment ethos for the Middle East?
Yeah, interesting. I mean, generally we're still at that stage where enablement is happening.
Yeah.
And in the enablement space, you're looking at solutions that are disruptive, but that take place at a certain stage. And if you look at the US and you look at China as benchmarks, and you look at India as an example, and certain Asian markets are probably slightly ahead of here insofar as the amount of capital that's gone in and the scale achieved, like Shopee and Lazada and so on. What you get is, you get businesses which are, number one, defensive, where the moat around their business model is highly defensible. It's hard to attack them because they've got all the elements around a business model, a team, an economic model, and a way of doing stuff where the innovation is built in. So, they will keep pivoting and keep scaling, keep changing, and keep growing because they've understood how to stay ahead of competition. So I would say generally, first of all, you're looking for market leaders. You're looking for the companies who are going to be the number one in the space, possibly a number two, but generally speaking, if you're going to be number three and number four in a market, forget it from a quality investor perspective. The notion of the market, of course there'll be of course logistics is going to become 6 or 8 players, but it's not going to be 30 players.
Yeah.
So there's a consolidation that will happen, which is the nature of market behavior. And you want to bet on the winners. You don't want to bet on the also-rans. Because yes, some of them may even succeed and make money, but they may not be venture capital theses. They may get acquired by a family office or do a strategic exit, but they're not going to become the Kareem or the Kitobi. So I think, first of all, you're looking for winners. Secondly, in terms of sector, to answer your question, I broadly agree with you on e-commerce. I mean, there are certain types of sectors which are interesting, where even the incumbent big players globally have struggled.
Yeah.
You take fashion. Amazon's not a dominant name in fashion e-commerce. You take furniture. IKEA is not a dominant name in e-commerce because it's a very fragmented, localized market. Mm-hmm. They've got advantages as a brand, but they're not geared for e-commerce. They're geared for big showrooms.
And their business model is based on that experience.
And they can leverage the showroom and even do a kind of a mail order type thing, but they're not necessarily geared for localized, smaller scale, smaller volume type opportunities. So you look at HomeSmart in Egypt, or Vivense in Turkey, or Dekaruma in Indonesia, and then you look at the success of Wayfair in the US, you start seeing enormous opportunity in that segment. So I would say e-commerce, if you're going to sell, electronic goods, forget it.
Yeah.
Which is one of the AWOC challenges.
Yeah.
where you're doing either low value stuff to a transient population, or you're doing the core electronics type sectors, even if they're low ticket price, where you're just competing on commodity product with people who can just sell it cheaper than you can, with a longer tail of more SKUs than you, with a Chinese supply chain.
Again, goes back to the defensibility too, right?
Right, and all the issues of, stuff from China taking 25 days to come and all that.
Yeah.
So, I agree. So, I would say selective e-commerce still for sure, marketplaces selectively still. I think health tech, telehealth, digital medicine, remote diagnostics, patient trials, businesses like, I guess, Okadoc and various others, the Babylon Health type players in Europe and multiple players in the US. So I think that's definitely a space. Remote learning, education is a space, content to some degree, enterprise solutions. You're starting to see the emergence of big players in many geographies around the world who provide industry-specific enterprise solutions in healthcare or in beauty, and even we've invested in a business in Latin America called Beauty Date, which is an enterprise solution for beauty salons, which is a gigantic industry in Brazil. Cosmetic surgery, beauty, and all that is a massive industry everywhere, especially here, but it's certainly true in Brazil, with a huge geography and a huge kind of retail footprint around salons.
Yeah.
So, giving them an enterprise solution specific to their industry is a good industry to be in. So those would be the key that come to mind.
And I'm super curious because, you check all those boxes, industry, sector, opportunity, defensibility, et cetera. But then over time, I'm wondering how you've learned to kind of evaluate and assess entrepreneurs, founders.
Yeah.
And what's the common thread between the ones that have been successful and not?
Super interesting. I mean, this is where it gets interesting, but it's an area where, everybody's an expert on other people, which is a danger, because you ignore your own bias, you ignore your own nature, and you think you can judge other people. And that's dangerous.
Super dangerous.
But there are certainly characteristics that you can see in people, and the defining characteristics around success tend to be, the core of them tend to be common. I mean, number one is tremendous drive, but it can't be a myopic drive. I mean, you meet people who are they're driven, but they're kind of blind. It's they're kind of they just focused on that thing and they can't see what's happening here and here, which is called competition. Mm-hmm. Or it's called a existential threat to your business.
Yeah.
So you've got to be driven, but at the same time open to what is happening in your industry and open to having a radar around how you need to keep evolving and pivoting your model. Behaviorally, you've got to attract people for the long term and keep them. And the first lesson is probably build a co-founding team made up of people of complementary strength to you. I mean, I've been a founder as well, way back. Biggest mistake I made was thinking I could do it and hiring people who were smaller than me rather than bigger than me. So you've got to think who's good at the things I'm not good at and who's actually better than me. And if you can build a team around people better than you, then you're a leader. If you build people smaller than you, then you're not much of a leader. And that's another characteristic. And another one is certainly around being able to act in a mature fashion with multiple stakeholders, with your shareholders, with your board members, with your team members, with your leadership, with wider stakeholders around you, including government and regulatory. You've got to be energetic, driven, and yet the characteristic I see a lot is a maturity that exceeds people's years. Most of the people that we've invested in successfully and that I've seen and admired, they're somewhat mature beyond their years. They've got all the energy, drive, and focus, but there's something very grown up about them. So, Mudassir Karim, I think, certainly had that when you saw him 2013, 14, 15. There was a clear degree of emotional stability there. You can kind of see this guy's not really going to change because he's grown up And those guys were lucky because they were slightly older anyway. I think they were probably in their mid-30s at that point, as opposed to mid-20s. But I think that core of emotional stability is there. So, it's partly a psychometric thing. It's definitely track record of what's on paper and the 360-degree feedback and your perceptions and how they conduct with you and what other people tell you and what other shareholders tell you. But it's also to do with the unpredictability of emotional behavior, because people react and act differently in different circumstances. You give success to some people and they become pretty painful, and you give success to some people and they stay the same, and you give it to some people and they get even more humble. So you need, but then none of those are necessarily wrong either. I mean, a guy who gets bigger and more successful, that's kind of okay as long as it's manageable as well. But then being larger than life is not a bad thing either. So it's a very, very interesting area around quantitative stuff, analysis, other people's opinion, your judgment as a person, but also the fact that you can't apply one rule because everybody's different. Mo is different to Mudassar. He's different to Sami Tugan, he's different to someone else.
But there are, to that point, so I completely agree with you, but there are, to that point, common threads that I keep seeing within people, let's say like Mo or Mudassar, etc.
The common stuff here is, I think, the stuff I talked about, which is really around that degree of maturity as a core characteristic.
That humility, that focus, that drive.
And then passion, harnessed the right way. Values. It's interesting. I'm probably like you, I'm a big music fan, and you look at the trajectory of musicians, and it's the same thing where you can become successful and incredibly rich and worshipped and become a bit of an asshole, or you can have all of that and amazingly some people stay the same, if not become even more decent people who are even more conscious of the luck of their position and the world around them. And then you get people who pretend to be like that, but actually they're not. So the point being, human beings come in all forms, but often in the music world, the people who have that stability are the ones who became successful a bit later. It's literally, if you became successful at 25 or 27, as opposed to 17, it's potentially a completely different set of behaviors you have because you've seen enough of real life. And if you haven't seen enough of real life, then it can go either way.
So it seems like if we go back to, and we're backtracking, how the region can generally improve fast enough and quick enough is to have enough alumni continue to multiply.
I think it's a major factor, which is the more, and that's an important part of being a leader. You've got to recognize you're going to lose people.
Yeah.
The biggest threat in being a venture capital funded founder or a founder in a tech business is I'm increasingly going to lose brilliant people, which was never the case in even my generation, never mind my dad's generation. It was a job for life. You stay for 5 years, 10 years. I don't know anyone of high caliber in any of the companies I mentioned who's going to be there for 10 years, including some of the founders. It's a different mentality. And I think for me, the big challenge, if I was Mudassar or Magnus or Mo or Sami or anybody else, would be, how do I deal with knowing that some of the amazing talent around me is just not going to be there in 3 years' time? I'm going to have to, because you can't treat them as if they're short term. You do everything possible to keep them, but you're going to keep generally a certain type. And there's another type, like yourself, or Nelio, or people like that, who are just going to go, what? I really think I can do something for myself. Yeah. Because there's a thing we all have where, to some degree, as confident humans, you don't want to be living someone else's dream. If it's a common dream of everyone in the team, then that's great. But there's a certain point where you go, actually, I'd rather be the master of my own destiny, even in a smaller platform, because it's something I did. And that's a natural human tendency, and the founder almost has to protract it to the point where he accepts that, but just goes, okay, I get that, but just hang around for 3 years and you'll have more freedom to be able to do what you want to do. that's nearly one of the places that you have to go to, because you just know you can't say to Chris, no, you shouldn't do anything. Stay with us. I mean, that's not a valid.
That's the reason you hired him in the beginning, because of that incessant drive.
The drive will show out eventually in the need to do it yourself.
Yeah.
It just will.
And so, really interesting conversation I had with somebody yesterday. I can't, say too much about who that person was, but we had a really interesting conversation about kind of why people want to, raise a lot of money, build, extremely valuable companies and exit, huge amounts, right? And it's not necessarily about the payout, because there are two ways to get rich. There are, create a very valuable company and exit, or there is, build a business that makes you a lot of money, right? That I posted about it yesterday and you commented about it. You can build profitable business where you never raise any money that can make you very, very rich and you own 100% of your business.
Right.
Or you can build an extremely valuable company and keep a tiny portion of it and sell it. And the outcome is generally the same in your bank account, but more people tend to, dream of those big exits and those big valuations. And I was having this conversation yesterday, which is why I posted that. And we kind of agreed that the reason people do that is because they're running after trophies. They're not running after income, or it's not about the money, it's about the trophy. And this whole, notion that valuations, big exits, the celebration of huge fundraisers are trophies, are celebrations of showing my awards. It really got me thinking, is this addiction to this competitive kind of trophy room showcase, is that really what it's all about at the end of the day? And how productive is that for society, for the economy, for job creation, etc.? How sustainable is this trophy battle, for an emerging market like the Middle East?
I mean, it's a really interesting question. You take, going a bit more international, you take San Francisco as an example, and you're struck by the extraordinary wealth in Silicon Valley,
Yeah.
and the poverty on the street in San Francisco. I mean, you can't walk around San Francisco without unintentionally bumping into a homeless person on the pavement in front of you.
Yeah.
It's something people like Mark Benioff at Salesforce have realized, that what are we doing? We're creating enormous wealth with poverty on our doorstep and just walking over it as if I made my money and I don't care. And informed people like him have really understood that it's an unsustainable model, because the amplification of that wealth with the poverty that you see on the streets of so many countries, it's an unsustainable model, and it's still happening. It's been exacerbated by COVID. It's got worse. You look at public markets in the US, you look at the success of even IPOs in the current period, Airbnb and Pinterest and so forth. And no disrespect to any of those people, because it's all deserved in many ways, but it's exponential and unbelievable wealth, most of which doesn't appear to be filtering down into the societies that those people come from. And various people have tried to address it, Warren Buffett and so forth, around the programs that they've created around leaving your wealth partly to your family, but largely to society in general. But we as venture capitalists and we as founders, we haven't yet grappled with it, because I think we're still in that phase of, I just want to make as much money as possible, whether it's trophy, whether it's money, whether it's material possession, whether it's, I've got a friend called Ben Aragondale who's a writer in London. Ben and I have this discussion often. It's usually psychologically pleasing dad. We all want to please the actual or the dad we had. And we want to do stuff to go, Dad, look at my, MVP trophy from football, or look at my company success, or look at my car, or look at my whatever. We want to please Dad. If we don't want to please Dad, we want to please other people or impress other people. And if you look at the convergence in society between, entrepreneurship and fame, it's become rock star level.
Absolutely.
Where guys in Silicon Valley are kind of like, there's a convergence. Suddenly Ashton Kutcher is a venture capital investor, but suddenly the venture capital investors like a rock star. It's like everybody wants to be that guy watching the Lakers game from the front row with Jack Nicholson 2 seats away. And everyone wants to be that guy, even though they don't admit it. And Jeff Bezos, and it's all bodybuilding, and it's which Scott Galloway says it better than me, so I'm not going to go there.
Yeah.
But it's all that thing of the Ray-Bans and the pumped up physique. So you get all of that, and then venturing into entertainment, because many of these companies end up in content in Hollywood effectively.
Sure.
So it's all converging, and it's not necessarily healthy insofar as I don't know who's solving the problem or who's really thinking about it. I mentioned Mark Benioff, he's a good example. And there are certainly others.
I mean, listen, I think there are some knights out there. I agree with you, like Mark Benioff, and the way he's using his organization, the whole like Ohana programs that he has, everything he's done, that kind of, it's quite amazing. But generally speaking, the whole kind of, I would say, framework of how this kind of high growth, lots of money casino that we've built, if for lack of a better description. I mean, if you look at the parallels between, wealth disparity between rich and poor and the growth of those kind of, VC accessible money, high growth tech startups, it's correlated. Like, I don't know if you can blame it, but I think the correlation is definitely there. And what is our responsibility, right? Like, what's the responsibility of a VC? What's the responsibility of an entrepreneur? I mean, we always hide behind the notion that, an entrepreneur is going to, that solves a real problem and, for the betterment of society. And then, he'll be able to raise funds. But fundamentally, what we're seeing is that the disparity and the lifestyles are getting worse, right?
It's getting more amplified. I mean, take the Peter Thiel type ethos, which is, I'm going to go off and live in New Zealand because I don't need to deal with real world issues that I helped create. So, that degree of irresponsibility, which is bordering on, neo right-wing mentality. I mean, what's that about? So, it's like,
But it's crazy because the notion that, today startups, to raise money, to succeed, to be able to sell to consumers, to be able to attract growth, there's this promise of I'm going to have a positive impact on society, a big and positive impact on society. And the more that's being said, the wider the disparity in our society. So it kind of feels like we're living in a very indulgent kind of
people
lifestyle.
Say stuff because they know it ticks a box. I mean, if you want to raise quality venture capital in Silicon Valley, you need to talk the talk a little bit. And so there's a lot of talking the talk. But it's interesting because, you get someone of this kind of Steve Jobs school who, broadly speaking, was not incredibly philanthropic when he was around, because his mentality was, well, I'm enabling human beings with devices and hardware, largely speaking, that builds education and builds capability and builds knowledge and builds connectivity. That's my social role. I'm just enabling hundreds of millions of people. And you can see the point of that. And then you get the other mentality, which is a bit more obviously ESG, sustainability oriented. What can I do around programming, and what can I do around other geographies and other sectors like education and healthcare particularly attract a lot of that type of capital. And then you get people who, they talk the talk, but they don't actually do much. And then you get the Kareem example where, to be fair, creating eventually hundreds of thousands of captain roles is an enormous impact because, you can see the effect in countries like Pakistan of the father who's here, he's working as a captain, he's earning certainly in the thousands of dirhams a month, certainly historically post-COVID, I think it's become much more challenging for a lot of those guys.
Yeah.
But you talk to them a year and a half ago, and even if they were making a few thousand dirhams a month. That's, in local currency in Pakistan, in rupees, that's a lot.
Yeah.
And it feeds the kids and it puts them through school and it builds a family, which doesn't need to worry about money. So that's a form of enablement, because the moment you have, 100, 200,000 of those people, you've actually created an ecosystem of self-employed people. But you talk to the same guy now, and he's got a car loan, he's got obligations around, the vehicle he drives and the inability to earn the income that he could have, that he was earning, a year and a half ago. So, it's very tough to find a solution if you're a founder. I think you've got to, you can either do it in the business you're building, which I think is the best way to do it, to embed it in your business model, or you can go, I'll make money and then I'll be kind and generous and benevolent and do stuff, which is fine as well. You can't grumble, because a lot of those platforms deliver meaningful value to ordinary people.
Sure.
So it's a really tough one. I mean, but what I do see, which I think is true, and you've hinted at, is the explosion of selfishness in the last 12 months is certainly something I've never seen. I mean, I've never seen, and I'm certainly not talking about the region, I'm talking about the US. Just the disparity and the ability to accept the disparity as normal and to say, I don't really care because I'm doing well in the public markets. I mean, that disparity can only blow up, and it's blowing up and it's not going to stop.
I think final question. You've been investing in people and companies for a long time. Right now we're seeing a lot of, the emergence of so many funds in the region. And I've had this debate many times with many people, kind of off the record. And, some people say that, it's a skill. Investors should stay as investors and entrepreneurs should remain entrepreneurs. Builders are builders, investors are investors. And a lot of the alumni from a lot of the successful organizations, Kareem, etc., have also joined funds now at the moment. And there is this two-sided debate that, one, it's good to have an operator builder within a fund, because if one's done it before, he can recognize it. And the other side is, well, being an entrepreneur, being a builder versus being an investor is two very different roles in an organization, and they shouldn't overlap at all, because that's when the relationship gets a bit murky and things don't really work out. And now we have hundreds of VCs and we have tons of money available. In your mind, what makes a successful VC? Based on your experience. Sorry.
Yeah. I would say you have to be a good unemotional investor. And what I mean by that is you can't do deals which are volume driven, velocity driven, competition driven, or personal relationship driven per se. You've got to do the best deals because you're managing other people's money. And any bias in your deal doing process is going to show through in the performance of your fund. So, first of all, that pressure a regional fund may have to do lots and lots of stuff is going to result in a lower probability of success, because you'll end up with low double-digit, if not single-digit outlier success, and you'll have a bunch of companies that won't really get very far. And that's generally the VC model at its normal average form, do 20, 25 deals and up 2 or 3 of them play out to success of a thesis that cleans up everything else. I mean, I don't buy that model at all.
Yeah.
I really don't buy that model. Because for me, it's about doing the best deals and being patient and finding the right opportunities. So, number one, you cannot have deal fever, as one calls it. I mean, You've got to do the right thing. Secondly, you've got to have a thesis around your role and the value you can bring. being a passenger in a deal that is being driven by other people is fine as long as you're happy to sit in a car driven by someone else whose capabilities to drive that car you believe in. And that's not always the case. So unless you're in the driving seat, as you're tempted to be, and you should be if you're operationally oriented, good luck. But you've got to have firm belief in the other investors, because they may not necessarily have the capabilities you have, or they may have capabilities that exceed yours as well. So sometimes you do deals to learn from other funds and to take a deliberately subordinate role, because we're going to learn from this. We may not be in the driving seat, we may not even be on the board, but we're comfortable that the people steering it are perhaps bigger than us and they're doing the right thing. So I went from a fund which was always dominant, always board seat, always control, always strong strategic influence, to a fund now that believes, Rise Capital, that believes the same things. And more often than not, we want to be in the driving seat around board and around strategic value add, but it's not always the case, because if you do a deal like Kitobi, there's going to be way, way bigger tickets, sort of multi-millions that may not be, the size of rounds that you invest in. And then the investors got to be, we talked about the founders' quality. I always feel guilty talking about founders, because the obvious question is, what should an investor look like? If you talk to founders, they'll give you horror stories around investors. They'll tell you about behavior, about pressure, about lack of competence, around many types of characteristics which are not good. So even if you're a founder, you've got to take capital very carefully. So, an investor's behavior has got to be as mature as a founder's behavior, and that's not always the case. And, funds can have empowerment, they can have lack of empowerment, where senior investment teams don't have authority, they don't have power, they don't have control. So, that's a more detailed question, but I think between, active ownership, between doing deals for the right reasons, and having a set of behaviors that even founders admire, that's what you need to strive towards. Because if the founder doesn't respect you and you're not held up as a good example of what an investor should be doing and how he should be or she should be behaving, then you're not much of an investor.
But it sounds, to hyper summarize what you said, but it sounds like what you're saying is the biggest quality, the leading quality, is investor experience, investor maturity. It kind of sounds like it's not operator or builder from an entrepreneur experience.
So that's a slightly, maybe I misunderstood your question, but I think operational value add has got to be in your DNA. Because I think, any fund which is just made up of investors who come from, an investment banking background or a VC background, I don't think you can be effective as an investor unless you've got operational experience. And it's like everything. I think, guys leaving Kareem to become investors, some of them will be good investors, some of them will be pretty bad investors, and some of them will go, this is not for me. So the reality is capital doesn't give you expertise. It's like, I'm rich, therefore I'm brilliant. Not at all. There's a lot of money in the region here, which is inherited. Doesn't make you a genius, but there are not many people who are going to tell you that.
Yeah.
So you could be a great operator and also not be much of an investor, but you can also be both. So the answer is, it's like any industry is going to shake out. You'll get operators who become investors who are good, and you'll get operators who become investors who are not very good. But for me, one of the big things I gained in my past career was you had to spend time in the. I started in a portfolio company in Pakistan for 2 years before I moved into a private equity fund. So I had, aside from the preceding career, I had 2 years of working in a private equity funded business with all the transformation challenges and all the pressures of reporting and performance and being part of a leadership team and being one of the troops in a geography like Pakistan, which is tough as a foreigner or as an expat. So, I think where it blurs a bit is actually good, but, like every industry, it's going to shake out, I think.
Interesting. Completely agree. Thank you for your time. We've been speaking for almost an hour. It's a pleasure having you on the show.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot for your time, Ovais.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.